introduction. Is it working?
Yes.
We are going to do the papers in order on as they are on the program. For those of you who may float in or out or want to go to other things, we are going to follow that order. The papers will be given. I'll have some short comments at the end, and then we'll open the floor up to questions. But let me introduce our three panelists. Our first person, or panelist who is here next to me, is Professor Jeannie Welch, who earned her graduate degrees at the University of Denver and Arizona State University. She is a retired professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and this is the fun fact, is a former champion on the intellectually challenging American television game show Jeopardy! Our second panelist is Professor Brian Chow, who is on the faculty of the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College, where he specializes in Asia-Pacific politics, Great Power relations, international security, naval studies, political geography, and U.S. defense and foreign policies. He is currently completing a book titled Continental Great Powers, Naval Development and the Quest for Influence on Land and Sea. Our third panelist is Dr. Jessica Huckabee, who joined the Joint Advanced Warfighting Division of the Institute for Defense Analysis in 2005. At IDA, she has supported projects for OSD policy, the military services, the National Guard Bureau, and most recently, U.S. Indo-Pacific Command in the Office of Net Assessment. She is also a retired cryptologic warfare commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve and is completing a book titled Sea Power Rivalry, The Influence of Admiral Gorshkov on American Naval Thought, 1963 to 1985. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Professor Welch and talk about the Russian Imperial Navy.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming to the last session of the last day. Appreciate it. Okay, what I'll do is, if you go to next, this is the area we're discussing. This is Eastern Siberia. And when people think of the Imperial Russian Navy at this time, they think of the Russo-Japanese War, which was a disaster for the Russian Navy. I'm discussing life before the Russo-Japanese War. And I'll go into a little bit about this area. We're going to be talking about the Sea of Okhotsk, which is not familiar to Americans, the Bering Sea between Siberia and Alaska, the Kamchatka Peninsula, and the very bottom is a former Russian naval base, and the provincial capital of Petropavlovsk. We'll also be discussing Vladivostok, which is at the southern end of Siberia, which became the Russian naval base and is still the base for the Pacific Fleet of the Russian Navy today. And we're going to be discussing the Amur River, which runs north of Vladivostok, which is a major waterway. I have, if you go to next, please. Okay, a little bit about Eastern Siberia. It was settled in the year 1647 by Siberian Cossacks looking for fur. And so it was under the jurisdiction of the imperial government and the governor general of Eastern Siberia. And similar to the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company, the Russian American Company was a chartered government agency that controlled all of the commercial enterprises in Siberia and across the Bering Straits into Russian America, which is present-day Alaska. Okay, if you'll go to the next slide, please. And here's a quickie view of the Russian Navy up to that time. Peter the Great is considered the founder of the Russian Navy. There were two major fleets, the Baltic Fleet and the Black Sea Fleet. Another Tsar reorganized the Navy in 1797, and the first officers' training school was founded in St. Petersburg in 1827. By most historians, the Russian Navy was considered inferior to the French and British navies. It was slow in adapting technology and in economic development. And I've listed here all the reasons it was bad off, according to the book, Russian Imperialism and Naval Power. Geography was not in its favor. It was a long way from St. Petersburg or even the Black Sea, sort of neglect. So they had that to deal with. Politically, the Russians were more interested in land-based operations. The bureaucracy was bad. They didn't have the shipbuilding capabilities of the Western powers. The officers were poorly trained. Next, please. Okay, this is the Pacific Fleet. The first Imperial Navy ship showed up in 1715. And in 1731, you may know this, but at that time, lesser naval operations were called flotillas. And it was named the Okhotsk Military Flotilla. And it was based in the port of Okhotsk, which is on the eastern shore of Siberia. They also began building their own ships, and they were finally reinforced by ships from the Baltic Fleet in 1845. In 1849, the naval base was moved to Petropavlovsk, which is at the southern tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula. It was renamed the Siberian Military Flotilla and then the Pacific Squadron in 1863. And in 1871, the base was moved to Vladivostok, and it was renamed the Pacific Fleet, although I found conflicting years for it being renamed. And according to Jane, Frederick Jane, Jane's Fighting Ships, he did a history of the Imperial Navy published in 1899, and he considered Vladivostok to be a second-class place. It had very small ship mending or ship rebuilding capabilities. He compared it to the British fleet in Jamaica, so he didn't think very much of it. I will now discuss, next slide, the ships of the fleet and how it grew from 1745. It had 8 vessels, and then it went up or down. By the 1840s to 1850s, it had 11 vessels. And just to give you an example of the size, I've included here 2 corvettes, Bogatyr and its size, and the corvette Gamarva and its size. In 1894, it had 6 cruisers, 4 gunboats, and 7 destroyers or torpedo boats. The U.S. Navy, which had been active in Siberian waters, called these ships armed steamers. We'll go on to next. Okay, I'm going to discuss 3 events here. One is the Crimean War in the 19th century. The Baltic and Pacific fleets wintered in the U.S. during the Civil War. And then there were serious maritime disputes between the U.S. and the Russian Navy in the 1880s up until 1902. First, I'll discuss next the Crimean War. You might be surprised to hear about the Crimean War in relation to the Russian Navy in the Pacific. If you're not familiar with it, most people would think of Crimean War, they think of Florence Nightingale opening hospitals, or Alfred Lord Tennyson's epic poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, about the Battle of Balaclava, into the Valley of Death, Road to 600. Okay. We'll go on here. It was a conflict between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, because Russia was moving down into the Black Sea region, which the Ottoman Turks considered their landscape. And they were allied with the French, the British, and the Italian kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. So ships of the Great Britain and France, who both had Pacific fleets, under British command, with a combined staffing of both British and French soldiers, they made for the Sea of Okhotsk just to give the Russians a hard time. So they attacked Petropavlovsk. If you go back to the map slide, we'll go back there. There we are. Okay, at the very tip of the Kamchatka Peninsula is Petropavlovsk, and the British attacked it twice. The first time they made it as far as the shore batteries, but couldn't get into the town itself, so they left. And they came back again, but the Russians knew they were going to come back, and so the Russians had evacuated the city, and so the British burned some buildings. The British did not equip acquit themselves well in the Crimean War in Siberian waters. They tried to capture Russian fleets, if you go back to the Crimean War. Yes. They would lose them in the fog. They didn't have good maps of the region. And the only ship they managed to capture was a Russian-American company, a merchant ship that had got stranded on a sandbar. So they captured it. And that was about it. They would find Russian ships, lose them in the fog. They had trouble finding the Amur River, which was vital strategically because it was well fortified by the Russians to increase their territorial claims against China. So they finally managed to find it, and they burned a few villages. A witness to this was the U.S. Navy in their naval North Pacific exploration expedition in the 1850s. They saw the burned out villages on the Amur River. They saw the burned out in Petropavlovsk. And according to Frederick Jane, these events were of no importance, and they weren't. Militarily, politically, they did nothing. So we'll go on to the next one. They wintered in San Francisco, again for geopolitical reasons that had nothing to do with protecting Siberia. In 1863, Tsar Alexander II, the Tsar Liberator, ordered the Baltic Fleet to go to New York City and the Pacific Fleet to San Francisco. They did this because it was politically advantageous for both countries. For Russia, Russia was undergoing the January uprising. If you're not familiar with that, in 1863, Poland was an unhappy part of the Russian Empire, and in January, they rebelled against the Russian government. The Russians feared that Britain and France would try to blockade the Baltic Fleet because they were sympathetic to the Poles. The reason that the Pacific Fleet went to Vladivostok was the Sea of Okhotsk would ice over in the winter, and this way they had a warm water port to send their fleet. Although one of their ships sank right outside San Francisco Bay. The U.S. was happy to have the Russians come because they wanted to protect their port of San Francisco, because that's where the gold was shipped out to the Union armies, to the U.S. government to support the war, and they didn't want Confederate raiders trying to get these gold shipments. Also, the U.S. was afraid that Britain and France were sympathetic to the Confederate government, and because especially the British had a big naval base in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and they didn't want them interfering with U.S. shipping. They will move on. Everything was goodwill with the Russians during this time, but if you go on to the next slide. Okay, these are the maritime disputes. One was over U.S. whaling, and the second was over U.S. seal hunting. The picture there is of the North Pacific or northern fur seal. This seal was especially prized for the warmth of its fur. And so what happened here was U.S. was the world's leading whaling nation in the 1850s. We had more whaling ships than the rest of the world combined. Also, in terms of seal hunting, we were also great seal hunters. The Russians were even better seal hunters. That was one of their major reasons for coming to Siberia, was for the fur trade. The Russians were not great whalers. They tried commercial whaling, it didn't work out, but they came to resent foreign ships taking their whales. Now, if we go on to the next slide, please. Okay, this is the maritime disputes. As far back as 1821, the Russians tried to prevent foreign ships from hunting and trading in Siberian waters. They sent out imperial decrees saying, you can't come here. The decrees didn't work. They came anyway. And then in the 1867, American whaling ships in the Sea of Okhotsk were stopped and turned away by Imperial Navy vessels, which Americans referred to as armed steamers, especially a steamer called the Elite. And the Americans, of course, protested that these ships had been turned away because the ships would go to the American consulate in the then independent Kingdom of Hawaii and complained that the Russians kept us from whale hunting. So the Minister of Marine, Admiral Krabbe, said there were no orders to keep Russians, to keep Americans from whaling there, and that it was all a big misunderstanding. And our Secretary of State, Secretary Seward, whose name should be familiar, he's the one who bought Alaska, accepted these explanations. Finally, in 1881, the Russians decided to play hardball because at one time there were over 200 foreign whaling ships in the North Pacific, including some in Siberian territorial waters, either on the Bering Sea or the Sea of Okhotsk. And they sent out a decree that any ship within Siberian territorial waters had to have a special license that could only be issued in Vladivostok. And so the Russians started to stop and impound American ships. This began in the 1880s, and of course the U.S. protested because the American owners of these ships would complain. They took away all the, they took our seal skins, they confiscated the fish we had caught, and things finally came to a head in 1891 and 1892 when 4 American ships, 3 seal hunting ships and 1 whaler, were stopped by the Imperial Navy, and the cargoes were confiscated. In 3 cases, the ships were impounded and the sailors were imprisoned. Of course, America did not like this. So I'm going to discuss one incident that was probably the most violent, if you go to the next slide. This is the schooner James Hamilton Lewis. This was a seal hunting ship in the Bering Sea, and they were stopped by the Elite, the same ship that had stopped the ships previously. They fired a blank shot, they boarded the ship, and the captain refused to give up the logbook, which the Russians took anyway, took it back to the Elite, and returned and demanded that the captain and most of the crew aboard the Elite. It tried to sail away, the Russians fired a shot, and it was captured. The captain of the James Hamilton Lewis, remember we're looking at the American version of this, said he was forced to sign Russian language documents that he did not understand, and he protested that the seals were caught on the high seas, which is known as pelagic seal hunting. The Americans claimed they suffered indignity and harsh treatment while in Russian custody. And the whaling was such an important industry, and this was such a big incident that it was reported in the New York Times. That's how important it was. Now here's the Russian version of what happened, slightly different. They stated that they did fire a blank shot, thank you, that they boarded the ship and they saw evidence of illegal seal hunting. And they had also claimed that they had seen the crew throw evidence, probably seal skins and seal hunting equipment overboard, that they tried to sail away, and so the Elite fired shots. They claimed that the captain of the James Hamilton Lewis was insolent and that the first mate drew a knife on the Russians. Okay. The ship and the crew were taken to Petropavlovsk and then to Vladivostok. Remember, there were 4 ships involved at this time. So after years of diplomatic negotiations, the 2 sides agreed to international arbitration held in The Hague. And the arbitrator was Monsieur Assa of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And they called him the Honorable Arbitrator. The Russian agreed that 2 of the ships were a mistake. They should not have captured the Cape Nana, a sealing ship, and the Cape Horn Pigeon, a whaling ship. The Americans demanded indemnities for all 4 of the ships, for the crew, for fact that they lost a seal or whale hunting season when they were impounded. And after arbitration, the arbitrator found in favor of the Americans in all 4 cases, but with one exception, not for the amount that the Americans wanted. The Russians were given 1 year to pay, and at that time, in international maritime arbitration, you could ask for interest from the date of the seizure, and so they asked for 6% interest. So if we'll go to the next one, I'll try to finish up. Okay, that's all that. Go to the next one. I'll try to finish up, so how's my time? I'm good? Okay. That the Pacific Fleet was the stepchild of the Imperial Russian Navy. They were so far, and it was so hard to get supplies and reinforcements to them. Even after the Suez Canal was opened, it was still a big deal, even after the Trans-Siberian Railway. And so it was sort of a lesser known arm of the Imperial Navy. But the fleet was necessary because it warded off foreign incursions. They were particularly concerned about the British influence coming to the North Pacific. And they were there to guard Russian natural resources and commerce. Besides defending the shores and the rivers, they ferried supplies to all the little outposts, the remote outposts of the Russian Empire, and even over to Russian America, when they still owned Alaska. So I have a brief bibliography here. Go to the next one. It's really hard to find information, especially in English, on the Imperial Pacific Fleet in the 19th century. But here are a few of the sources I cited. Frederick Jane, Jane's fighting ships. There was a Mr. Jane. He wrote an extensive history of the Imperial Russian Navy, published in 1899. He barely mentions the Pacific Fleet. It is considered of little importance. So I will end there, and I hope you have a little knowledge of a little known fact in naval history, the Pacific Fleet of the Imperial Navy.
Thank you. Now we'll turn the floor over to Professor Brian Chow, who is going to talk to us. This paper is titled "The Communist Luxury, Soviet Naval Development and Lessons for Today's Great Power Politics."
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I'm about to share my screen. Okay, so thank you again, and good afternoon from Rhode Island. I'm delighted to be a part of this panel and the McMullen Naval History Symposium, even if virtually. My presentation is called "A Communist Luxury, Soviet Naval Development and Lessons for Today's Great Power Politics." And my paper is one chapter from my book project on continental great powers and naval development. I must begin, however, with the usual disclaimer that the views presented today are my own, and they do not necessarily represent the views of the Naval War College or of the United States government. So over the next 20 minutes or so, what I'm going to do is discuss Soviet naval development during the Cold War from about 1956 to 1991. Before that, however, I'm also going to give some context to this paper by discussing the book project, just to better situate the paper within its context. And then I will conclude with some implications for 21st century China. So my book project seeks to explain this question. What explains the variation in outcome when continental great powers hybridize, i.e. attempt to build strong navies? Now, great powers can be categorized in a number of ways. There are, for example, continental powers, those with strong armies. There are naval powers, those with strong navies. And there are also hybrid powers, those with both strong armies and strong navies. So a continental power that develops a strong navy becomes a hybrid power, and a naval power that develops a strong army also becomes a hybrid power. Now, why hasn't my question been answered already? It hasn't, because the very idea of a hybrid military power tends to be dismissed, ignored, or subsumed under broader, imprecise measures. So in my home discipline of political science, we find that military power tends to be measured as just that, military power, a vague term to which one could assign any number of meanings, and that doesn't consider how different types of force may not achieve the same objectives with the same amount of effort or with the same probability of success. Each type of military force, Army, Navy, Air, is better at certain things than others. Naval power, for example, is particularly good for sustained power projection. In naval studies, it's simply assumed that a hybrid power is just a country that fails to become the dominant naval power, the one with the world's #1 navy. But just because a country doesn't have the world's best navy doesn't mean it's a failure, and it does not logically follow that a country without the world's best navy is by default a hybrid of some sort. And finally, in security studies, one finds the argument that there's just no such thing as a hybrid power. That every country, whatever the composition of its military, has a quote-unquote true character that is either continental or maritime. Now, neither the past nor the present suggest this is actually true. The contemporary United States is a hybrid great power, arguably the most successful one of all time. Furthermore, such logic actually ignores the far more interesting question. If every country has a true continental or maritime identity, why do so many try so hard to change that identity? So this combination of reasons is why my question and the issue of military hybridization in general does not appear to have actually been investigated in any sustained or in-depth manner. Now, an important question remains, who cares? Why is military hybridization important? And what you see here in front of you is a picture of US forces landing in Normandy. D-Day was one of the most militarily complex and politically consequential operations in human history. This was fundamentally a hybrid military operation, 200,000 sailors using 7,000 naval vessels to ferry over 150,000 soldiers. It could not have been done without hybrid military force. And military's hybridization to international politics can actually be traced back through the centuries, right to the days of antiquity. Rome did not begin to flower as the empire we have come to remember it until it complemented its formidable army with a navy that overthrew its Carthaginian rival, allowing Rome to become #1 on both land and sea. The story of Judah Ben-Hur may be fictional, but its depiction of Roman naval power is not. Turning from the past to the future, a potentially hybrid great power is, of course, China. US-PRC relations are the most important bilateral relationship this century, and the growing naval arms race between the two will be a primary determinant of the bilateral relationship's development, and by extension, the progress of world affairs. So what explains the variation in outcome when continental great powers hybridize? I argue that two factors explain the difference in results: investment persistence and threat diffusion. Investment persistence is simply the sustained political will and financial support to pursue naval development. This may sound obvious, but is in fact a very difficult thing to do for a continental great power that is dominated by its army bureaucratically and by perennial landward security concerns strategically. Threat diffusion is the deployment of one's navy to places or for purposes that do not antagonize the dominant naval power. Great powers tend to notice when one of their own attempts military hybridization, but it is the dominant naval power that is most concerned because it has the most to lose, and it probably feels like it is being directly challenged. By sending one's navy to places or for purposes not antagonistic to the dominant naval power, one is less likely to incite a hostile response. So if the continental great power can have both investment persistence and threat diffusion, instead of just one or neither, then it'll be more likely to succeed at building a navy it wants and actually getting to use it. Now, I examined the entire universe of cases of continental great power hybridizers from 1801 to the present. I choose 1801 because I try to minimize major developments in land warfare, and 1801 marks a convenient break-off point between pre-Louvain mass armies and the mass armies that we know today. The entire universe of cases in this time frame consists of France, Germany, Imperial Russia, and the Soviet Union. You see them arrayed here on a spectrum, and it is a spectrum. Success and failure are not binary. France anchors the success end on the left, having both investment persistence and threat diffusion. Germany and Imperial Russia anchor the failure end on the right, lacking one or both factors. I'll be happy to discuss any of these other cases in the question and answer session, but I will now focus on the Soviet Union, which was the country that posed the most credible threat to the US Navy and to US freedom of maneuver and action around the world. The Soviet Union sits in the middle of the success-failure spectrum. It is what I call an incomplete success. I could also use the adjectives ambiguous or partial. The basic point here is that the Soviet Union's hybridization attempt occupies a middle ground between the clear success that was France and the clear failures that were Imperial Russia and Germany. This is because the Soviet Union achieved real successes with its Navy during the Cold War, but it also suffered real constraints and setbacks, so that at the end of the day, its accomplishments were less impressive and less enduring than what the French had achieved in the prior century. For about 35 years, Moscow was very persistent in its naval development, but also very imbalanced in how it approached naval development. During that time, the Soviet Navy was also sent out to pursue conflicting objectives, to stand up for Soviet interests and prestige while not antagonizing the United States too much. Ultimately, the contradictions inherent in both the investment in and the diffusion of the Soviet naval force explain why the Soviet Union was more successful than outright failures like Germany or Imperial Russia, but nowhere near as brilliant as France. So taking investment persistence first, the Soviet Union wanted a Navy that was strategically on the defensive, but operationally on the offensive. And this was a Navy whose individual vessels were far more impressive than the fleet put together. The Navy's initial mission was to push out the Soviet Union's defensive barrier and create bastions for the fleet's ballistic missile submarines. Many Westerners assumed instead that the Soviets were focused on interdicting sea lines of communication, and this viewpoint helps account for the tremendous alarm that Washington began showing in the 1970s. The late Michael McGuire was one of the few voices in the West who pointed out with increasing exasperation that the Soviets were actually on the defensive. The irony is that Soviet naval development actually did go some way in fulfilling the original objective of bastion defense, though as I will discuss shortly, new missions would soon be tacked on for a Navy not suited to achieving them. Building a fleet designed for bastion defense in waters close to home led to a large Navy with glaring shortcomings, such as limited weapon reload abilities, short ranges beyond shore, and severe deficiencies in things like fixed-wing aviation, naval infantry, i.e. a Marine Corps, amphibious capabilities, and a logistics tail. Soviet vessels also tended to compare poorly with their US counterparts in endurance, survivability, and tonnage. But the Soviet Navy was also brand new, and in some respects, like the speed of certain vessels, seemed to pose real challenges to the United States. The observer C.M. Hertzfeld opined in 1971, quote, "In 1950, the Soviet Navy was a poor joke. In 1960, it was quite small and not of any great capability. In 1970, it is large. Let us say it is the second largest and the most modern Navy in the world. If I were a Soviet defense specialist, I would be quite proud of the strides that have been made," end quote. A 1980s analysis written for the US Congress asserted that the Soviet Navy was, quote, "the most serious challenge the US Navy had ever faced." So the Soviets had persistent investment, just not balanced investment, resulting in the paradoxical situation of a Navy that simultaneously looked powerful and constrained. Now, the Soviet Navy's initial objective was simply bastion defense, and Admiral Sergei Gorshkov was canny enough to use bastion defense as a justification for all the surface vessels that Nikita Khrushchev so famously and repeatedly criticized. However, Moscow later changed its mind as to what its Navy ought to do. The cause was the Suez Crisis, not, as is commonly presumed, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was the Suez Crisis that revealed Moscow's inability to project power and influence that conflict in any way. And it also opened Moscow's eyes to the fact that there were all sorts of governments and popular movements in the Third World receptive to Soviet patronage. So Moscow decided that its Navy, heretofore built for bastion defense close to home waters, would be tasked with the additional missions of sailing out into the world to uphold Soviet prestige and standing, and to assist and defend like-minded actors, as well as protecting Soviet fishing fleets, countering the United States and later China more generally, and potentially serving as a political bargaining chip. However, as the Cuban Missile Crisis would show, the dangers of Soviet-American confrontation were very real, and Moscow also decided that its Navy-driven activities around the world should not antagonize the United States beyond a certain point. So on the one hand, the Soviet Union wanted to stand up for its prestige and interests. On the other hand, it did not actually want to provoke the United States in too many places too often. These two goals were what the political scientist Franklin Griffiths labeled reluctant expansionism and limited expansionism, an incredibly muddled and contradictory attempt at threat diffusion. Having been built for bastion defense, the Soviet fleet was not equipped to sail around the world, fly the flag, and defend allies. Given the long lead times in ship construction, as well as the Soviet economy's own debilities, this mismatch between mission and capability would not even begin to be addressed until the 1970s. The result was a Soviet Navy that could sail around the world, but inconsistently so. A Navy that could show up in a crisis, only to stand by and be unable to change the outcome. And a Navy that helped advance Soviet global interests, unless ideologically flexible third world autocrats and Moscow's own ham-fisted diplomacy reversed hard-won gains. Soviet Navy did rack up a number of successes. During the USS Pueblo crisis in North Korea, or with North Korea, the United States dispatched a 25-ship task force towards the Korean Peninsula. The Soviet Union responded by sending its own fleet to stand between the US fleet and its North Korean ally. On the other side of the world, a couple decades later, the Soviet Navy helped guard the air bridge ferrying Cuban troops to Angola. The Soviet-backed group won that civil war and has ruled Angola ever since. The Soviets started showing up in the Mediterranean Sea and the Indian Ocean and staying there. The result that Moscow had become a permanent presence around the world. Retired US Admiral James Stavridis, who spoke last night, recalls his impression as a young officer in the 1970s that the Indian Ocean had become, in his words, a Soviet win. But these successes must be weighed against the real limits to Soviet naval power. The 1967 Six-Day War between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, and Syria offers an apt example. During that conflict, the United States dispatched 2 whole carrier strike groups, and the United Kingdom contributed naval vessels as well. To back up its Arab friends, the Soviet Union sent 13 vessels to sit off the coast of Crete, 500 miles from Israel and behind the US and British forces. So Moscow wanted to appear like it was playing an influential role in the conflict, but in actuality, it did not do anything substantive. Fast forward to 1973 and the Yom Kippur War. There was a big alarm in the United States over Soviet support for the Arab countries, with the US military's defense readiness condition raised to 3 at one point in the conflict. However, Moscow deliberately waited until after the crisis had peaked before it began surging its own forces into the Mediterranean to give the appearance that it was doing anything. And it was precisely this type of superficial Soviet support that led Egypt to turn towards the United States later that decade, costing Moscow access to one of its very few geostrategically useful overseas naval facilities at Alexandria. These overseas facilities were doubly important because the Soviet economy itself was dying and utterly incapable of servicing the Navy's needs. And the resulting necessity of husbanding resources meant that the Soviets settled on a strategy of surging vessels to hotspots at particular moments, which perceptually only further inflamed the threat in US eyes. In the context of the bipolar zero-sum Cold War, the Soviets' contradictory strategy proved unworkable. Real Soviet advances in terms of defending interests and securing allies were balanced by the Soviet Navy's inability to actually check US naval superiority or to change US policy in any substantial and permanent manner. Investment persistence that did not match capabilities with taskings, combined with a muddled attempt at threat diffusion to result in incomplete or partial Soviet military hybridization. This explains how the Soviet Navy could simultaneously arouse feelings of anxiety and condescension. It achieved just enough things to cause the former and failed at just enough things to induce the latter. To look at this from another perspective, however, one could argue that the Soviet Navy proved a cost-effective tool of Soviet national policy. The response in Washington to both the improvements in the Soviet fleet and the growing numbers of deployments and operations culminated in the famous maritime strategy of the 1980s, its supposed 600-ship Navy, and the strategy of horizontal escalation. As it happened, the US Navy never got anywhere near a 600-ship fleet, but the strategy is a sign of just how alarmed America had become and just how seriously America was taking the Soviet naval threat. Now, what can the Soviet experience tell us about contemporary China, today's potential hybrid great power? Today's China has investment persistence in spades. The number of new classes of naval vessels, to say nothing of the number of new naval vessels themselves, is astounding. The Chinese state continues to invest heavily in naval modernization at the expense of its ground forces. In 2015, the first military strategy released under Xi Jinping called for China to abandon its traditional mentality of privileging land over sea and to instead appreciate the significance of the maritime environment to Chinese power and prosperity. Even with a national economy whose growth is slowing, China's emphasis on naval development shows no sign of waning. The role of threat diffusion, however, is unclear. At present, we don't actually have enough evidence to say how China will use its navy. A lot of what you read about Chinese behavior in the maritime environment, say in the China Seas, actually refers to China's Coast Guard, constabulary forces, and maritime militias, not to its navy. And as this audience knows, the distinction is not just semantic. There are a variety of legal and operational differences between navies and other maritime forces. Despite the dearth of operational evidence to date, there are at least three possibilities to consider. The first is that China will stay in its near seas, here the East China Sea, the South China Sea, excuse me, and up here the Yellow Sea. China's most important interests are there, and self-defense is a big concern, what with large US forces in the theater. The second possibility is that China will move out to what it calls the far seas, so particularly out into the Indian Ocean and out into the Pacific. And it will become a true blue water navy, routinely deploying around the world. And the rationale here is that as a growing great power with global interests, China will naturally deploy its capabilities to guard and maintain those far-flung interests. The third possibility is that China will remain focused on the near seas, but maintain capabilities to go out into the far seas when necessary. In other words, China will venture out beyond regional waters for specific purposes, but China will not deploy its blue water navy to maintain a regular presence throughout the world's oceans, as the United States has done over the past 75 years. The crucial questions that not only determined how Soviet naval development evolved, but how the United States perceived and responded to the Soviet Union, are the same fundamental questions we must ask of China. Investment persistence. How big will China's navy get? We don't actually know. What capabilities will China's navy have? Will it actually be capable of the full spectrum of blue water operations, or will it also turn into a weird, imbalanced force like the Soviet Navy? Threat diffusion. Where will China's navy go, and what will it do when it gets there? These are the key questions. Aside from the Gulf of Aden anti-piracy patrols, there really isn't a lot of Chinese overseas naval activity to analyze beyond diplomatic port calls. America's perception of and response to China will rest largely on the answers to these questions, just as America's perception of and response to the Soviet Union was driven in large measure by what the Soviet Navy did and where it did it. Jeffrey Till wrote a quarter century ago, quote, "It is difficult to come to a final conclusion about whether the Soviet Navy represented rubles well spent," end quote. The analytical difficulty stems from investment that was persistent but imbalanced, and from contradictory fleet diffusion. The Soviet Union ended up using a navy that was not holistic in capabilities to accomplish objectives it was not designed for, and that were themselves contradictory. This was the root cause of the lack of clarity and consistency in Soviet naval development. Imbalance and contradiction fueled negative perceptions. They did not suggest deliberate restraint on the Soviets' part, merely frustrated ambition. Clarity and consistency are thus vitally important for a great power relationship as consequential as the US PRC one. We have seen remarkable consistency from the Chinese in naval development, but very little clarity. Indeed, we have seen deliberate obfuscation. Basic facts remain unknown, to say nothing of policy intentions. China has not published a shipbuilding plan, so we don't know how big its navy is intended to be. The publicized defense budget is so spare and opaque that we can't even be sure it includes the aircraft carrier program. It is possible that Chinese leaders themselves haven't figured out all the answers and are working through them as they go along. In any event, greater transparency about what the Chinese Navy is becoming, where it will sail, and what it will do would go a long way in alleviating the type of worry that in the 1980s gave rise to the United States maritime strategy and aspirational 600-ship Navy. The United States marked a milestone in 2020. Last year, America became an Asia-Pacific power for exactly half of its lifetime, 122 of 244 years. For those of us accustomed to thinking of the United States as historically and culturally tied to Europe, this is an eye-opening milestone. America has not been a European power for anywhere near as long. But whether we talk about Asia or Europe, continental great powers face similar geostrategic challenges across space and time. And a return to the Soviet Navy of the last century, I believe, is a still fruitful way to think about the Chinese Navy of this century and its implications for the United States. I will be happy to elaborate further on some of the things I haven't touched on or simply glossed over, but I will stop here for now. I thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Going to talk about the Soviet Blue Belt of Defense, origins and evolution of a concept.
Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation will look at the Soviet Blue Belt of Defense that emerged in 1966 and puzzled the West for years afterward. It is often cited as the predecessor to today's anti-access aerial denial strategies, yet the history behind it is not well understood. I'm going to use an interactive timeline that is based on declassified intelligence, open source analyses, and news reports from figures that offer a red and blue perspective. And I'm going to make that link available at the end of my presentation. The central figure here is Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, the leader of the Soviet Navy for most of the Cold War. The Soviet Navy surged into the world's oceans under his leadership starting in the mid-1960s, as we've heard, transforming from a regional force of mainly coastal and medium-range submarines to one capable of distant deployments and open ocean operations. Yet the need to defend the Soviet Union much closer to home still appeared to be the top priority for Gorshkov's emerging blue water force. Excuse me. As the Soviets watched the American naval threat evolve with Polaris submarines and ever more capable strike carriers. As I begin here, the standard caveat applies that these are my own views and not those of IDA or the Department of Defense. Glimpses of the Soviet preoccupation with the maritime zones to buffer against sea attacks came when GRU Colonel Oleg Penkovsky provided American and British intelligence with classified articles in which Soviet admirals discussed sea theaters and maritime axes and how to protect their coastal borders, near sea zones, and open ocean zones against an enemy's sudden attack with carriers and submarines. The real concern was, of course, with the U.S. Navy's new SSBNs equipped with Polaris missiles that started deploying in 1960. Soviet naval forces would need to cover both near and far zones with limitations in their operational capabilities that would persist through most of the Cold War. Foremost was the reliance on land-based naval aviation, not having large deck carriers, and insufficient ASW forces and capabilities. To compete with the Americans while defending its own maritime approaches, the Soviet Navy would need a much more balanced fleet, and there was no graver advocate for this than Admiral Gorshkov. He made the case in the Soviet military press for more surface ships to defend against all zones of operation. In the July 1963 edition of Morskaya Spornik, Gorshkov used his annual Navy Day address to call for an active defense, quote, within the limits of defense and the zone of the maritime theater. With his usual ambiguity, Gorshkov did not elaborate on the details of the zone. Both uniformed and civilian Soviet naval watchers in the West began to write about the implications of nuclear submarines for the Soviet Navy's traditional roles and missions. Hanson W. Baldwin, a Naval Academy grad and the military editor for the New York Times, was especially focused on the Soviet naval threat. Baldwin wrote in April 1963 that, according to Soviet sources, the Soviet Navy's primary wartime mission was the destruction of enemy subs and carriers, and then its current focus was on acquiring the defensive capabilities to blunt the enemy's first strike. Baldwin interpreted this new mission as taking Soviet naval forces out to the high seas of the world and away from the now narrow, shallow seas around the Soviet heartland. Baldwin's views would foreshadow the coming debates among Western experts over forward defense. Specifically, the debate was over whether Soviet forces in the Med and elsewhere were defending forward against Polaris submarines, that is, in response to the American naval threat, as British expert Michael Maguire would argue for years, or whether they were signs of a more offensive-minded turn in Soviet naval thinking and a direct challenge to U.S. naval supremacy, as espoused by American admirals and other navalist-minded politicians and analysts. To declare that the Soviet naval threat was defensive by nature, you had to be clear about what precisely the Soviet Union had to defend against, where they intended to do it, these are the zones, and above all, how this defense would be possible given the major Soviet limitations in forces and capabilities. The best example of this defense-minded camp is Commander Robert Herrick, anyone who studies Soviet naval studies during the Cold War should be familiar with. He was a naval intelligence officer, fluent in Russian, and getting his PhD on the Soviet Navy in the mid-1960s. Herrick went up against official naval thought and declared that the Soviet Navy was strategically defensive, that Gorshkov was bluffing, and that he could not take on the U.S. Navy without carriers. Gorshkov's real wartime concerns were much closer to home, even if Gorshkov had global blue water ambitions engaged in propaganda that exaggerated Soviet capabilities. Commander Herrick picked up on Gorshkov's discussion of a defensive zone in his own paper for an academic conference in 1964. Herrick explained that the zone to defend against Polaris submarines actually encompassed the Arctic, the Western Atlantic, the Med, the Western Indian Ocean, and the Mid-Pacific, and that an enormous number of subsurface, surface, and air ASW forces would be needed to wrest command of the sea from the west, and this force would be prohibitively expensive. This was a sea supremacy force. Herrick pointed out that the Communist Party and the Red Army leaders were not going to fund for Gorshkov, thereby dictating priorities to him of where, when, and how he could defend the Soviet Union in a war at sea with the West. Herrick further argued that a weaker naval power like the Soviet Union could deny a strong one control of the seas in a limited area for limited periods. Herrick concluded that the Soviets were building a defensive deterrent naval force and not a war-winning one. In the outbreak of war, quote, most, if not all, of the Soviet naval forces would be preoccupied with countering the NATO naval strike forces, and that the Soviet Navy would be able to spare few, if any, forces to initiate an early campaign against merchant shipping, unquote. For American naval officers, the nature of the Soviet sea power became a matter of heated debate from the mid-1960s onwards. The small and vocal number of analysts, such as Herrick, maintained that the Soviet Navy was a strategically defensive force, even in the face of the Soviet surface ship buildup, increased out-of-area deployments, and strident propaganda from the Soviet leaders about the striking power of the Red Fleet. This evidence presented the analytical triad of watching what the Soviets built, what they did, and what they said. And this triad would be used by O&I to great effect during the later Cold War. By practicing strategic empathy, these officers understood that Gorshkov's difficult strategic and operational decisions were driven by time and space constraints if the Soviet Union faced a superior naval force with carrier task groups approaching its shore. The employment of Soviet forces, they argued, reflected these defensive priorities in a wartime scenario that would feature layered anti-submarine and anti-carrier defenses. Soviet naval defector and former destroyer Captain Nicholas Shadrin offered a fascinating and one-of-a-kind red view on the Soviet Navy in March 1965 when he gave a classified lecture at the Naval War College, in which he described in great detail the three major zones projected at various stages away from Soviet shores. Zone number 1 was a close offshore zone, approximately 150 miles out. The defensive mission against the enemy carrier task force was most critical here and well covered by shore-based aviation and missiles, as well as ASW forces. Sea control was expected. Shadrin said the Soviet considers this to be their zone, which they can control. Zone number 2 was a remote offshore zone, 150 to 300 miles offshore, with no air power there on a permanent basis. You would find Soviet surface units, such as Kashin and Kidna class destroyers, operating here in the zone for the ASW fight. And finally, zone number 3 was the open ocean zone more than 300 miles out. It included the distant maritime theater and the sea lines of communication all the way up to the enemy's coast. While the first 2 zones were clearly of a defensive nature intended to protect Soviet territory, here Shadron saw operations that were not purely offensive or defensive, but oriented towards sea denial operations. It was primarily a domain for Soviet anti-submarine submarines. So by the mid-1960s, the Soviet Navy under Admiral Gorshkov was transforming into blue water navy with global ambitions, while its wartime defensive orientation was remaining closer to shore. Against this backdrop, an announcement at the 23rd Communist Party Congress grabbed press headlines around the world. Soviet Minister of Defense Marshal Malinovsky announced a new military term without further explanation at the Party Congress in Moscow in April 1966. He declared to the party elite, quote, "We stand calmly and confidently on guard for the peaceful labor of our people, especially now that the establishment of the Blue Belt of defense of our state has been completed," end quote. So Malinovsky's numerous boastful announcement during the speech added to the confusion over what the Blue Belt of defense actually was. He had just spoken about advances in rocketry before he introduced the term, so that could have indicated it was referring to a missile defense system. He'd also just proclaimed that a group of Soviet nuclear-powered submarines had just completed an underwater cruise around the world, so that led other observers to conclude that it had to do with submarines. The Western press covering news of this closed session wondered what on earth Malinovsky meant by a blue belt to defend the Soviet Union. Was it a new weapon system, a new operational concept, or was it something else entirely? Anonymous sources in Washington, we always have those, told reporters, quote, "We think it is a new surface-to-air missile, which is not yet operational. We think, we do not know." The mention of nuclear submarines also indicated that the naval power could form the backbone of the new defense. And the Washington rumor mill fed speculation that the phrase referred to an anti-ballistic missile system with new interceptors. As the Blue Belt story was getting attention, Commander H.G. Dudley, a destroyer commander and recent Naval War College grad, wrote in the pages of proceedings in May 1966 that, quote, "For the foreseeable future, we can expect the Soviet Navy's role to be offensive in the Cold War and defensive and hot. The primary mission of Soviet naval forces in wartime is most likely the defense of the water approaches to the Soviet Union." That same month, CIA issued a report. It said they learned from Soviet sources that it was not actually one system, but a combination of systems consisting of 4 elements: air defense missiles, aircraft, submarines, and anti-missile systems. But the U.S. intel community did not have evidence that there had been any ABM breakthroughs in the Soviet Union. However, in November, National Intelligence Estimate foresaw future advancement in radars and interceptors. And as for it being a complex of 4 elements all working together, U.S. intelligence had no indication that such command relationships existed in practice. At the same time, open source reports in the U.S. newspapers confirmed that Soviet subs and naval air power were indeed part of the mysterious Blue Belt. News stories quoted East German defense minister here, General Heinz Hoffmann, who spoke publicly of the striking power of Soviet land-based missiles before he stated, quote, "To this are added the atomic submarines of the Blue Belt of defense, which can operate in every sea around the world," unquote. And here we have the clearest statement on public record yet that the Blue Belt involves submarines. Oops. So by the end of 1966, it was clear that the Soviet Union had embarked on a new concept for the strategic defense of its borders. But the precise role of the nuclear submarines and the capabilities of the concept it would require was still an open question. Was it a close-in defense, or was it one that extended far out into the Atlantic, the Mediterranean and elsewhere? Did it also include strategic strike? Soviet leaders offered no further explanation ever in the future of Malinovsky's his remark, aside from a few clues in their writings and what could be observed from the Soviet Navy in action. It is likely that the Soviet leaders concluded that it was of little use and established such a vitally important concept if they did not at least acknowledge it to both domestic and foreign audiences. Their deliberately vague announcements served notice of a defensive being while also providing some measure of deterrence by injecting uncertainty in the U.S. strategic calculus and raising doubts about the West's ability to strike the Soviet Union in a general nuclear war. In 1967, oops, excuse me. There we go. In 1967, some Western press reports reflected the growing belief that the Blue Belt was a strategic deterrent line against U.S. subs and carriers, and the appearance of the Soviet Navy's answer to the U.S. Polaris submarine, the Yankee-class SSBN, further fueled speculation that these new subs formed a forward-deployed deterrent. This was especially true after they were featured in the Navy Day Parade in July '67. These press reports offered similar versions of offensive-defensive wartime scenarios of earlier analyses. The Soviets could strike U.S. target with their new SSBNs while defending their own SSBNs in territory against U.S. strikes. These are the pro-SSBN and anti-SSBN missions that would only grow in importance for the Soviet Navy's strategy for the remainder of the Cold War. Got too far. There we go. There is Admiral Gorshkov on the cover of Time magazine in February 1968. As the 1960s progressed, Admiral Gorshkov became more vocal about the importance of naval power. He promoted its political and military usefulness to the Soviet state and frequent distant deployments to the Med and Indian Ocean, as Brian had told you about. However, he also made at least 4 public references to the defense of Soviet borders between October 1967 and October 1969. The other documents of the era also reference repeated references to repelling or repulsing attacks from the sea. And Gorshkov's 1968 Navy Day radio address include the assurance that the Soviet Navy was capable of taking its defense line out into the ocean. All of this was leading up to a shocking and big reveal for the world in 1970. I've embedded in my timeline here a YouTube video of the official Soviet propaganda from Okean. Okean was the global exercise in April and May 1970. It involved approximately 200 of the Soviet Navy ships and submarines, hundreds of aircraft from all the 4 fleets operating as separate task forces under unified command from Moscow. The maneuvers spanned the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, as well as their adjoining seas, and included, notably, simulated anti-carrier strikes within minutes of each other on opposite sides of the globe. The exercise also featured anti-submarine warfare and amphibious ops and a demonstration of capabilities of the Soviet naval buildup by the late 1960s. This included the Moskva helicopter carrier, the Cresta-1 guided missile cruiser, the cannon-guided missile destroyer, and the IL-38 May medium-range ASW patrol craft. There we go. Okean was an exercise of the Blue Belt of Defense and its command relationships, according to Robert Herrick. By this point in the timeline, Commander Herrick had retired from the U.S. Navy and was a civilian analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses. His 1973 report traced the history of the still little understood concept. Herrick determined that based on reporting out of Moscow, the concept was probably a unified plan involving all the other branches of the armed services to defend against American ballistic missile strikes. In particular, the Soviet Air Defense Forces likely conducted a staff exercise during Okean that was not apparent to the West. Admiral Gorshkov had a major message for American readers in the 1970s, that the Soviet Union had a right to defend itself with all the means at its disposal, including the ability to execute a strike from the sea on the U.S. He emphasized the message in his book, The Sea Power of the State. Gorshkov made the stark point in The Sea Power of the State that the vast continental expanse that had thwarted earlier invasions of his homeland had vanished. the Soviets faced an existential threat in the Cold War, and Russia could no longer hide behind the buffer of space thanks to the U.S. nuclear triad. And so the Soviet Navy needed to recapture what time and space it could by extending the traditional defensive perimeter, using the Blue Belt of Defense several thousand miles out to sea. Gorshkov declared, "Our country has built a modern fleet and sent it out into the ocean to support our state interests in order to reliably defend itself from attack from the vast ocean sectors." So here we are in the late 80s in the home stretch. An article in the Naval War College Review noted that the Blue Belt of Defense had actually moved by that time from concept to capability, causing serious problems for Western military planners. Yet the U.S. Navy would soon have a strategy and planning solution that would transform not only itself as a naval power, but radically alter the power dynamic with its rival. The U.S. Navy was about to embark on its own naval renaissance with a plan for a 600-ship Navy to respond to the Soviet naval threat. Time with the military buildup during the Reagan administration, the Navy's maritime strategy took on the Blue Belt concept as the Navy interpreted it, and called for a bold strategy of, among other things, taking U.S. carrier battle groups beyond the Arctic Circle to strike at the Northern Fleet. Secretary of the Navy John Lehman emphasized the "attack NATO and you will lose" message of aggressive deterrence through a series of high-profile exercises, starting with Ocean Venture 81, which saw 2 carrier battle groups cross the ASW barrier of the GI-UK gap to conduct operations in the Norwegian Sea. The U.S. Navy finally and formally acknowledged the Soviet Navy's near zone and far zone concepts dated from the early 1960s. As John Lehman recalled in his recent history of the era, and he did not use the specific term blue belt in this quote, Soviet naval doctrine had long called for total Soviet naval control over the waters adjacent to the Soviet homeland and keeping U.S. and Allied forces well beyond those waters. The result by the early 1980s was an operational concept of sea control and sea denial out to some 2,000 kilometers from the Soviet Navy's bases. Lehman and other Navy leaders believed that the Soviet plans in the far zone included active sea control and sea denial to include attempts to sever NATO's slocks, and that these plans needed to be disturbed. This was likely incorrect with historical hindsight, at least in with regard to targeting of convoys. As Cold War naval expert Norman Polmar recently noted, quote, "The Soviets never planned to carry out a large-scale attack on merchant shipping in the so-called Third Battle of the Atlantic," unquote. What was more clear for the U.S. Navy by the early 1980s, and likely more accurate, was the Soviet emphasis on the near zone defense and the Soviet Navy's withholding strategy of keeping some of its SSBNs in port in the close seas to the Northern Fleet and other bastions in the Pacific to preserve a second strike capability and as a bargaining chip during a war termination phase. This pro-SSBN withholding concepts had its roots in the early 1970s with the introduction of the Delta-class SSBNs that had a 4,000-mile range for its SLBMs. The zone around them would be protected as planned for many decades by ASW surface ships, aircraft, and helicopters. In conclusion, the origins of the Soviet Blue Belt of Defense from the 60s to the 80s provides a case study on the evolution of the understanding of the important concept of a layered maritime defense and the challenges of its interpretation over the years. The Blue Belt eventually becomes shorthand for the Soviet sea denial strategy in the Cold War, and Naval War College professors today still use the illustration as early examples of an A2AD strategy. The exact details of the role of other Soviet armed services would play is still not known, but what is known with certainty is the Soviet Navy during the Cold War oriented much of its force structure, strategy, and plans to creating a dense buffer zone off their shores out to 1,000 miles using both sea and shore-based assets. This case study offers a few insights into threat perception. First was its temporal nature. It took years to unravel the purpose behind the term and for the Soviet Navy to deploy the host of capabilities that it needed to implement the concept, while key requirements for open ocean ASW remained an unsolved problem for Admiral Gorshkov. Notably, it took 2 decades from the first evidence of the near zone defense in Soviet naval thinking and the strategically defensive nature of the Soviet Navy for the U.S. Navy to recognize and respond to it. However, it took a few analysts, such as Robert Herrick and I didn't talk about him today, but Jamie McConnell at CNA, it took them much less time to recognize the application of the Soviet defensive thinking than it did the Navy as an institution. Herrick's ability to discern the motivation behind these deliberately ambiguous pronouncements reveals a second insight, and that's the importance of strategic empathy as an important analytical approach. Those that took the red view into consideration, especially the Soviet preoccupation with the defense of its borders and how it could counter a seaborne strike capabilities of NATO forces, provided necessary corrective against the often mirror imaging by a carrier-centric U.S. Navy. Analysts could gauge the correctness of assessments by using, finally, the analytic triad. By the 1980s, the Office of Naval Intelligence would look at 3 areas of analyses to see if they could get the proper understanding of Soviet naval developments. So they looked at what the Soviets built, what they said in professional literature, in speeches, and what they did in their exercises, like cocaine. In the case of the Blue Belt of Defense, there was broad alignment in all 3. This case study illustrates the difficulty of interpreting an adversary's capabilities and intentions, which was especially true of a closed system like the USSR, but also it underscores the timeless importance of knowing your enemy. Thank you.
These are all excellent papers. And I know you here and those in the virtual audience have questions that would be a lot more probably interesting than my comments. I would like to thank Professor Welch for her paper, which, this is the kind of these forgotten parts of, especially major naval powers, are always very interesting and kind of very analogous to, what the U.S. Navy is doing roughly at the same time and trying to expand its border. They claim to say, push commercialism, in this case, the Imperial Navy, trying to do the same thing while also, kind of finding a way for the Russian state and in an area that got very little support, very little attention, very little budget. And I would assume maybe a lot of times very little direction from headquarters. Professor Chow's paper is extensively researched, and it is an interesting case study of trying to how can you apply analysis of the Soviet situation, Soviet naval developments, and be somewhat, or attempt to be somewhat predictive with regard to what the People's Republic of China is going to do with their naval assets and with their forward-looking strategy. And this again, looking, with Dr. Huckabee's work on the Blue Belt of Defense and Gorshkov, underscores, I think, a similarity with both. The difficulty, she underscored here at the end with the kind of knowing your enemy, the difficulty of crossing culture, of trying to perceive what people are going to do. And I picked up on the carrier-centric comment there at the end, and dating myself and having worked at DIA and ONI in the early 80s when the Soviets started to build their first carrier. And I don't think we had more than a 2-day period that went by without OPNAV calling and saying, can you say it's a carrier yet? So a lot of this, the kind of sense here of knowing what your enemy wants to do, how much of the Navy's institutional response, they're very, very resistant to any kind of interpretation that the Soviets are not kind of a little brother who's finally grown up and has figured out how the world works and they're going to emulate. Therefore, what you have is a need to create a force structure that is even bigger. And this plays into a lot of interest within the Navy. But I will stop here and open the floor to questions, both from our people here in the room and also virtual questions on the chat. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
On the question of mirror imaging, no one has pointed out that a large part of the maritime strategy had to do with what the Soviets wanted to do about ballistic missile subs. Not only did they want to chase ours, but they wanted desperately to protect theirs. That's what most of the maritime strategy was about. And neither presenter was terribly interested in that question. We heard that the maritime strategy was responsive to a growing Soviet Navy. It wasn't. The maritime strategy had a lot to do with attacks on the Navy by real enemies like President Carter, with considerable firepower owned by alternate services, which I guess speaks back to the hybridization issue. It's about inter-service rivalry. Now, I certainly remember that from being involved in maritime strategy. No one wants to say anything?
No response.
Sorry for making a speech thing.
I'm sorry, I think I missed the first part of the question.
Well, what I was saying was that you spoke of the maritime strategy as a response to a growing Soviet Navy. It wasn't. It was a response, in fact, to attacks on the U.S. Navy by our main enemy, President Carter. And it had to do with what the role of the Navy was and things like that. Not everything is reaction to what the supposed enemy is. Most U.S. naval officers would regard the Washington Foreign Policy Establishment and the U.S. Air Force as far more serious enemies than the Soviet Navy ever was.
I certainly take that point, and of course there is a massive domestic component to both the United States and to the Soviet Union in terms of how they presented themselves and the things that they did. And there's no question that the Committee on the Present Danger, for example, which put in like half the Reagan administration, it seems, had a very big role in this. And they were not only reacting to what they saw the Soviet Union doing, but also to a perceived decline in US defense capabilities over the preceding decade. Just like in the Soviet Union, some of the things that Admiral Gorshkov did that seemed particularly alarming to the United States was primarily done for the bureaucratic purposes of maintaining the Politburo's financial support for naval funding. And one of the, for example, Dr. Huckabee mentioned the Okean exercises. A number of the major naval exercises that Admiral Gorshkov put into place during his 30 years at the head of the Navy were done actually to be timed after a new Soviet leader had taken power, with the purpose of making sure that the funding for the Navy would continue. So I certainly take your point. There's a massive domestic component here, but I think that the two arguments made do not have to conflict. If anything, they complement and reinforce each other, and that's not just for the United States, but for the Soviet Union and pretty much any country. So I certainly didn't mean to give the impression that I was only focused on external factors.
Well, the other factor is that however defensive they were, the Soviets had been running quite offensive strategic submarines for quite some time. If you look at their actual deployments, they're not sitting back there waiting to do something. Their navies have different components, and most of Herrick's argument was about the role of the Soviet attack submarines. And it looks, if you read some of the Russians' books, I'm thinking of Kuzin and Nikolsky in particular, it looks as though there was a time when there was a push for open ocean anti-shipping, and it went down the tubes. If you look at the construction programs, they're much more interested later in chasing Western boomers. And that was a major factor. I think that the Navy was not one thing or the other. I certainly agree that we grossly mirror image. There's no question. And there's no question. And the mirror imaging went to very pathetic things. Like a friend of mine who was in that business talked about how someone looked at a Russian carrier and said, well, where are the light attack aircraft? Because if we have it, they must. The other thing is, if you look at the Russians' own accounts of their carrier program, that ran all the way from things that looked a hell of a lot like ours to much less capable ones. It's very hard to do that kind of interpretation.
I don't think
Go ahead, please.
Oh, I mean, I don't think I disagree. I mean, the Soviet fleet was a very diverse fleet. And so if you look at US assessments, whether in government or outside of government, from both during the Cold War and afterwards doing retrospective analyses, if you focus on different parts of the fleet, then certainly there are going to be different conclusions reached. But I think if you look at the Soviet Navy in totality from its development in the 1950s up through the 1980s, yes, of course, different parts of the fleet are built for different things. And yes, of course, maybe you know, the nuclear submarines, the SSBNs and the attack submarines, you know, are a little more important in terms of, you know, the war plan for a particular scenario. But on the whole, I think the Soviet Navy presented a threat to the United States that was far more credible than what the United States was facing back in the 1950s, vis-a-vis, say, the 1970s, 1980s. And this, to go back to my earlier response, you know, the CPD probably was, you know, doing things partly from a domestic politics perspective, but that is not to utterly dismiss the objections they raised to Soviet improvements or to the lack of a U.S. response to them in the 1970s, or at least the perceived lack of a U.S. response to them in the 70s.
Do we have any virtual questions? Not yet. Anyone else have any questions? Yes, sir.
Yes, this is a question for either Dr. Chow or Dr. Huckleberry. What about Vladimir Putin? Is he attempting to recreate a Soviet model, okay, of Russian naval power, okay, with Russian naval power? Particularly, you know, we get reports that they're able to strike at Hawaii, okay, or that they're, you know, their reports, you know, on the news, okay. So is Putin attempting to achieve the same thing that the Soviet leadership did?
Yes, hi. I would say I have written on this for online that that Gorshkov provides a very compelling playbook for any great power competition to be used today. That you can certainly create a navy, a defense in being with just submarines, and you create a lot of difficulties for the U.S. because ASW is an extremely expensive undertaking. A lot of the U.S.'s ASW capabilities have severely atrophied in the last 20 to 30 years. So certainly, I think Putin thinks highly of the Gorshkov era, the heyday when Soviet submarines and at least their submarines meant something. So I think you see them a little bit recapturing some of this, but I don't believe it will get back to the level that we saw during the Cold War. Brian, I'll let you answer as well. Over.
I would completely agree. I think President Putin would really love to return to the heady days of the Soviet Union. But if you thought the Soviet Union's economy had troubles, just look at Russia's economy today. And I think that even if President Putin wants to sort of bring Russia back to what it was half a century ago, however that plays out, not just for the Navy, but for the other branches of the Russian armed forces, I don't see the economy being able to sustain that. To sustain the level of investment and expertise and human resources to bring the Russian military to anything close to what it had been decades prior. And so if Moscow is facing that reality, then I think for all their aspirations, they may end up having to fall back on a cheaper, asymmetric, smaller option in terms of manifesting a Russian naval presence.
I think I asked that question because has Putin really adopted Yeltsin near abroad, okay, to become a regional power, a regional country, like say in the Black Sea, okay, or the Mediterranean, but not necessarily a global naval power?
I think Putin is very clearly putting his stamp on Russia as at least a regional power. I think Russia has global aspirations in the same way that the comparison is not entirely accurate, but in the same way that France has global aspirations. But the economy is a huge limiting factor, and unless something dramatic happens, and I'm talking about this is even before the United States imposed sanctions, unless something dramatic happens in the way the world economy is run, I don't see Russia digging itself out of the economic hole. And it's not just economic. Russia is facing a humongous demographic crisis that looks to be both deep and long-lasting. So a number of issues that country is facing that would be the foundational elements to any healthy advanced military force.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Great question from Mrs. Welch. I missed some part of the presentation, maybe you said it, but have there been any clashes between the US and Russian Navy in that area?
No,
Not at all,
the North Pacific exploring expedition was welcomed by the Russian government. They talked to the ambassador in Washington, D.C. And so, and when the whaling ships were captured, we didn't send any
There was
fleet
no
up there.
protective measures were taken.
No, it's just diplomatic, and it was mainly the American ship owners whining. They took our ship, we lost a whaling season because the whaling season was very short in the North Pacific. And so, no, there wasn't a military option there. And the U.S. was big on international maritime arbitration, going back to the Alabama claims in the Civil War against Britain. So we took a peaceful route in trying to settle this. And frankly, by the 1890s, whaling was in a decline. It was at one time the 5th largest part of the U.S. economy. And New Bedford, Massachusetts was the wealthiest city per capita in the country because of whaling. And so we were a whaling nation for a long time, but that was the height back then. So no, there was no armed interference or any U.S. military presence that I could find. There is a 400-page documentation of the Maritime Disputes in Foreign Relations in the United States, the big compilation of American foreign relations. And mainly it's detailing how much money the owners of the ships wanted, that type of thing.
But they were all in Russian territorial waters, right?
Well, they claimed that they were not, that they were outside. They had they claimed different territorial limits beyond the standard 3 mile. There was something called Italian miles that they used. I don't quite figure out what Italian miles were. But they would claim that they were doing pelagic, which is seal hunting or whaling in the open waters. And the Russian says, no, you were near islands in the Bering Sea that belong to us, or in the Sea of Okhotsk as well. So no, it was just all diplomatic, and the American owners of the ships complaining, wanting their money back.
Please, one last question.
Question for you. The Russians end up with a big fleet in the Far East that gets wiped out. First at Port Arthur and later when they try to reinforce.
Yeah.
Is that related to these tiny fleets that were at Vladivostok?
The Russians sent reinforcements from the Baltic fleet.
I know, but before that, there's a big fleet in Port Arthur that gets wiped.
Yeah, Port Arthur did surrender. I didn't mention Port Arthur because it was, I think it was a lease.
Well, but was that a separate fleet, like not related to what?
No, it probably was part of but Port Arthur didn't come into the picture till 1894, which is sort of after my time
Okay,
period. But yeah, you're right. When Port Arthur surrendered, it was a humiliation for the Russians. It was, a day of mourning for the Russians practically, because in the Russian mentality, having Siberia, having an empire that reached the Pacific, made them a world-class power. They were on the same level as the British and the French. So anything that harmed Siberia affected their national image of themselves, I think. They called it the Primordial, that part of the Russian Empire.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
This gentleman had a
Oh, I'm sorry.
question.
Please go ahead.
This would be for Dr. Chow, or perhaps maybe Dr. Huckleberry could provide some insight. You mentioned in your presentation Soviet naval involvement in the war in Angola, I believe. How did naval forces actually fare in that civil war? We don't really hear about the Russian Navy getting into open confrontation often, and especially not supporting ground troops. So how did that actually end up happening in practice, sir?
So the Soviet naval forces did not engage in very much combat in the actual Angolan civil war. They were operating more of a support capacity off the shore. And the Soviets were providing airlift to bring Cuban service members to go help fight in the Civil War. And I think there were some Soviet forces involved as well, I think ground forces. So the Soviet Navy, in fact, was actually off the shore in just a supporting role. This was a very complex conflict. You ended up having 3 rebel groups enjoying the rotating support of either the Americans, the Chinese, the Soviets, or regional actors. And so the United States' interest in sub-Saharan Africa, frankly, has never been very great and was not particularly great. And that explains that's one of the reasons why the United States did not get involved very much there. But the Soviets made sure to get involved. And it was partly because of that imbalance in the great power support provided that the Soviet-backed rebel group ended up winning out. So the Navy in particular was playing a supporting role. It was not actually dispatching service members on the ground to do the fighting.
There was one question in the chat.
Tom?
One second, thank you. All right, this question is from Chris Madsen. They asked, how did Imperial Russia take advantage of the naval and land outcome in the First Sino-Japanese War that ended in 1895?
They didn't do much, quite frankly. I think it was more land-based myself. And it's sort of out of the purview of what I was discussing. I sort of ended in the 1890s. The Russians were sensitive to Chinese incursions into Siberia. So I really couldn't say much about that. When Russia was annexing land in Siberia, it was usually at the expense of the Chinese Empire. And even some of the natives in the northern parts of northeastern Siberia never acknowledged Russia as their overlord, or whatever you want to call it. The rest of the world just assumed that they were under Russian control.
Well, thank you all very much, and thanks to our panelists. And this concludes our lesson.
Thank you for staying for the last program of the last day.
I wouldn't say it to bug you, but the Sino-Japanese War was how they got put off.
Oh, yeah, I knew that, but it was a lease, I think, and not an outright ownership.
Yeah.
And then after the Russo-Japanese War, I think they
Thank you for your
lost
time.
it.